Hello, my name is Paul Ortiz, and I'm a professor in the Department of History at the University of Florida. Thank you for what you're doing this week. It's very important for the history of the farm worker movement, and it's very important for the history of our state. Shortly after I received an honorable discharge in the United States Army in 1986, I too joined the farm worker movement. Back then, I was working with the United Farm Workers of Washington State. We had a very long and uphill campaign to organize in the Chateau Saint Michel vineyards. It was a struggle against a multinational company that had a lot of power. They had a lot of friends in the state legislature. All we really had was the support of the grassroots religious, labor, student community, and after 8 years we finally won that campaign. It was a real exciting moment in my life. That's where I met my wife Sheila. We met at a UFW picket line. We were actually arrested together, and we decided that if we were able to stand jail together, that we could stand getting married. And we've been married ever since. So I've been asked to talk about a few historical issues, and for this first segment, I'd like to talk about the issue of the history of the civil rights movement, as well as the intersection between the civil rights movement and the farm worker movement. Now, what I'm going to say today is going to probably surprise you. I'm going to ask you to kind of suspend what you know about the civil rights movement, or to think about it, but also to think about the civil rights movement in a slightly new context. When we think about the civil rights movement, we often think about the March on Washington and Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. We think about people dressed up in their Sunday finest, suits and ties and jackets, and marching on the nation's capital. But the civil rights movement that I want to talk about today is a little different, because it was a movement powered predominantly by people who themselves were either agricultural workers, farm workers, or who had been just one or two generations removed from agricultural labor. If you think about the long civil rights movement, and now I'm talking about going back to the 1800s, one of the greatest leaders and spokesmen of that movement was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass had been a slave. He'd been a plantation worker. But we don't usually think of Frederick Douglass as a farm worker. I want to start by reading a short telegram that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sent to Cesar Chavez, who was president of the farm workers movement. And this was just after Cesar had finished a 25-day fast. And Dr. King in this telegram said the following: "As brothers in the fight for equality, I extend the hand of fellowship and goodwill and wish continuing success to you and your members. You and your valiant fellow workers have demonstrated your commitment to righting grievous wrongs forced upon exploited people. We are together with you in spirit and in determination that our dreams for a better tomorrow will be realized." So when you think about the civil rights movement, at the core of it was the concern over economic justice or economic inequality. And I mentioned Frederick Douglass. This is a quote that Frederick Douglass gave in 1857, and he was talking about how ordinary people, how farm workers, how at the time slaves and their supporters could win justice. And I think this quote, this idea, comes out of his experience as a farm worker. He says the following: "Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reform. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born in earnest struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want the rain without the thunder and the lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters." So Frederick Douglass, a former slave, says this in 1857. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing up the ground. That's really rich imagery. If you think about it, it comes from his experience of being an agricultural worker in the South, being a slave. Now, when you think about discrimination, and one of the things that the Civil Rights Movement, as we all know, was fighting was the Jim Crow system. There was a Jim Crow system in the Southeast that African Americans had to face, and there was also a system we also refer to sometimes as Juan Crow. That was a system of discrimination that Latinos and Mexican Americans and immigrants had to face in the Southwest. When my father grew up in Texas, for example, in the 1940s, he often would see these signs in public places that would say, "No dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans." And in places like Texas and Arizona and New Mexico and California, the Jim Crow system wasn't just about black and white segregation. It was black and white and Hispanic segregation as well. So these were things that both African Americans but also Latinos were fighting against. One of the big issues, of course, as we all know, was education, the right to an equal education. And some of the early cases that involved Mexican American parents in California, for example, became joined with the Brown versus Board school desegregation case in the 1950s. And those, we tend to forget some of the Latino ones, but they're really equally vital. So I want to talk about a few famous civil rights activists you may have heard of. And I want you to try to guess who this person is that I'm talking about, because she's one of the most famous of all civil rights activists in the 1960s. She was the granddaughter of slaves. She was the daughter of sharecroppers. She herself was a plantation worker in the Mississippi Delta. And like many women and men, African Americans of her generation, she had to drop out of school at a very young age and work on a plantation in order to help support her family. But in addition to all this, she became the leader of the most important independent political party in U.S. history in the 20th century, a party called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She was beaten so badly by the police on a picket line that she was permanently crippled. She did not allow this to slow her down. She once famously said, "I am sick and tired of being sick and tired." Now, of course, I'm talking about no other than Fannie Lou Hamer. Now, we usually think of Mrs. Hamer as a great activist, as a person who went to the 1964 Democratic National Convention and made a very powerful speech, so powerful that President Lyndon Johnson turned on his TV and saw her making the speech and called a friend in one of the networks and said, "We have to stop this woman from talking. She's going to bring down the whole system," right? But we don't often think of her as a farm worker, because she was a farm worker. So we need to think about who were the great civil rights activists, where they came out of. Another one that I want to talk about briefly is another person. I know you have heard this gentleman's name. Let me know, or kind of look at each other and see if you can guess who I'm talking about. He was a speaker at the March on Washington. He was a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He grew up as a farm worker. He would often talk about how the house, or really the shack that he grew up in, was so light and poorly constructed, and the walls were so thin in rural Georgia that every time a wind came through, his family was afraid the house was just going to blow away. And when he went to the March on Washington in 1963, this is what he said. I want to read a brief excerpt because, again, it tells you how his activism was rooted in his experience as a farm worker. He said, "We march today for jobs and freedom, but we have nothing to be proud of. For hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here. They have no money for their transportation, for they are receiving starvation wages or no wages at all. In some parts of the South, we work in the fields from sun up to sundown for $12 a week. People have been forced to leave their homes because they dare to exercise their right to register to vote. What is there in this bill," and here he's talking about a proposed civil rights bill, "to ensure the equality of a maid who earns $5 a week in the home of a family whose income is $100,000 a year?" Now, this is 1963. $100,000 a year in 1963 is a lot of money. But this gentleman, and by now some of you know who I'm talking about, John Lewis. John Lewis grew up in a society where predominantly black farm workers who were incredibly poor picked cotton and other crops that enriched the people above them, who became fabulously wealthy. John Lewis, as we know, went on to become a congressman, a quite distinguished congressman, who now has quite openly supported the Occupy movement. And I think there's a reason for that, because John Lewis didn't come from a wealthy background. He came from an agricultural worker's background. And he became one of the great civil rights activists, really, of the 20th century. Now, another dimension of the civil rights movement that I want to talk about briefly is culture or music. So now that we know that a lot of the great civil rights activists themselves were farm workers, let's think about the types of songs they sang. One of the most powerful popular songs, I'm sure that you all have, or many of you have heard the title of this song, is titled "Keep Your Hands on the Plow." Now, if you don't know about the history of agricultural work, the plow was something that you would sometimes hitch to a mule or a horse, and you'd use the plow to dig into the soil so that you could, plant your crops. And so when civil rights activists sang this song, "Keep Your Hand in the Plow," they were trying to communicate to each other and even to their adversaries a few things. One is, we're in this for the long haul. We're willing to work hard to change the society. I want to read just one or two verses from this wonderful song, "Keep Your Hand on the Plow." And this is a song that civil rights activists would sing at rallies and at marches to raise their spirits. And one stanza goes, "You can talk about me as much as you please. The more your talk, gonna stay on my knees. Keep your hand in the plow, hold on. When I get to heaven, gonna sing and shout. Be nobody there to put me out. Keep your hand in the plow, hold on. I know my robe's gonna fit me well. I tried it on at the gates of hell. Keep your hand on the plow, hold on." So what the song is saying is that as farm workers, we have experienced a lot of oppression, a lot of suffering, starvation. We have been to the gates of hell, but we're going to keep our hands in the plow. We're going to hold on together, and we're going to collectively fight for each other's uplift. In the early 1960s, a whole wave, cohorts of college students became involved in the civil rights movement, much like many young people are getting involved in the farm worker movement today. There's a wonderful photograph. I can't show it to you here, but I want you to just imagine it. One of the most famous civil rights activists in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was a man by the name of Stokely Carmichael. Some of you may have heard about him. But one of my favorite pictures is how he, as a young organizer, came into Lowndes County, Alabama, a sharecropping county, a cotton county in the state of Alabama. And the picture is of him actually holding a plow and pushing a plow through a field side by side with a black farm worker. Because what the organizers were trying to do in the early 60s, even those that came from privileged college backgrounds, was to demonstrate their solidarity with the people that they were working with, and saying that we're not too good ourselves to pick up a plow and to get into the cotton fields and pick some cotton. And one of the things that Stokely said very frequently, which was quite popular, was, "Our grandfathers had to run, run, run. My generation's out of breath. We ain't running no more." So I want to conclude with just a couple of thoughts. And one is the connection between agricultural slavery and the situation that we're in now. We know that farm work in North America and generally in the Americas tends to be low-wage labor. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that historically this is a economic sector which arose out of slavery. The most profitable sectors of the economy from about the 1490s through the end of the American Civil War were agriculture. Still, in many states like Florida, North Carolina, California, agriculture is still the number one industry. And so why are people paid so low or so little in most cases for what they do? Another activist in the March on Washington was a man by the name of Phillip Randolph. He was also a Union leader. And he said something at the March on Washington which I think bears thinking for those of us who are involved in the farm worker movement now. He said the following: "For one thing, we must destroy the notion that Mrs. Murphy's property rights include the right to humiliate me because of the color of my skin. The sanctity of private property takes second place to the sanctity of the human personality. It falls to the Negro to reassert this proper priority of values because our ancestors were transformed from human personalities into private property. It falls to us to demand full employment and to put automation at the service of human needs, not at the service of profits, for we are the first victims of unemployment." One of the things that Cesar Chavez tried to do before he passed away was really to talk about what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. meant to the farm worker movement. And in 1990, Cesar gave a talk which those of us in the farm worker movement I think should pay very careful attention to. Cesar Chavez was really disturbed by the way that Dr. King's image and his memory was being sanitized or kind of watered down. And what Chavez, the leader of the United Farm Workers, wanted us to remember is that Dr. King was about more than just abstract civil rights. And this is what Cesar said. He said, "My friends, the time for action is upon us. The enemies of justice want you to think of Dr. King as only a civil rights leader, but he had a much broader agenda. He was a tireless crusader for the rights of the poor, for an end to the war in Vietnam, long before it was popular to take that stand, and for the rights of workers everywhere. Many people find it convenient to forget that Martin was murdered while supporting a desperate strike on that tragic day in Memphis, Tennessee. He died while fighting for the rights of sanitation workers. Dr. King's dedication to the rights of workers who are so often exploited by the forces of greed has profoundly touched my life and has guided my struggle. During my first fast in 1968, Dr. King reminded me that our struggle was his struggle too. He sent me a telegram which said, 'Our separate struggles are really one, a struggle for freedom, for dignity, and for humanity.'" So in conclusion, I'd like us to think about a few questions and maybe workshop about these. One of them is, what are the connections between the farm worker movement and the civil rights movement? Also, who were some of the main activists? And what were some of the tactics they used that we can learn from today? And in conclusion, I hope you have a very good activity. I'm very proud of all of you for the work you're doing. We plan to bring down a lot of people from Gainesville to support the actions this upcoming weekend. Solidarity and peace to all.